Well, good morning, everyone. This is all part of family today, so I don't have to do the normal introduction like, I'm Bob Willie. It's nice to have a family and friends here today with everyone, and excited about our presentation today. We're going to be YouTubing it, so it's going to be an opportunity for others to be able to visit, to see it as well. Looking forward to that. This is our 7th season of Tuesdays with. You know the background on Tuesdays with Maury and what the history is of that and why we decided to choose that title for our Tuesday lectures. And we're already planning for 2024, 2025. We're planned for all the rest of this year as we come to the fall, which is great. Some wonderful speakers already on schedule, and looking forward to putting the rest of that schedule and announcing it probably by next meeting in March when we get together. Today, our February program is Tuesdays with Tom Strebeck. I got the pronunciation right? Sir. Good. I always have to do that because I'm always Bob Wiley, so it's nice to be able to get the pronunciation right. He is currently the technical assistant at Horry County Museum. If you have not been there, it is an outstanding museum, extremely interesting, very well done. My wife and I visited on a couple of occasions and have enjoyed it very much. He has previous experiences at Mount Vernon, where he served for a period of time, as well as Sturbridge Village in Massachusetts, where Carol and I came from. So we have some background. That's a great place. That's also a wonderful location, as well as South Carolina Confederate Relic Room and Military Museum. He is a guide for Historic Columbia and a graduate of Louisiana Tech, and did his graduate studies, got a little closer here at USC. And so we're very pleased to have him. His topic today is Historic African American Sites in Horry County, a topic especially appropriate as this month we celebrate Black History Month. This is something very important for us to understand and know, and to be able to put together maybe some tours or visits we can do as we get to some of these sites. Looking forward to it. So Tom, welcome. Looking forward to your presentation today.
Thank you. Well, thank you for that kind introduction and for your kind words about the museum. We'd love for y'all to come by and see us. We're open Tuesday to Saturday, so whenever the county's open, we're open. But you didn't hear me come to talk about the museum. You came here to talk about historic sites, so without any further ado, we're going to be kind of going chronologically. So we'll start in the 19th century and then meander our way forward into the 20th century. All righty. So the first site is the Ark Plantation. And to give a little bit of background here, once upon a time, South Carolina was a royal proprietary colony. So it was run by a group of men who saw it as a business venture. Their entire reason for owning it was to try to make money. And in the early days, their big industry, their big cash crop was indigo. And for a long time, that made them a lot of money. And then they realized there was something they could grow to get even more money, which was rice. And rice is a really, for them, it was an earth-shattering crop because it stores really well when you dry it out. It has a shelf life of pretty much forever. And for how light it can be and for how easy it is to transport, it has a ton of calories and nutrients. So you see this indigo economy shift to this rice economy all over, like across the South Carolina coast. And the Ark was one of these plantations, although it actually held on to indigo well into the 19th century, which is something not a lot of plantations did. And this plantation at its height was massive. It had thousands of acres. It had more than a mile of oceanfront property in what is today the very southern part of Horry County. And in the 1850 census, there were more than 50 enslaved people working there. And by the time you get to the 1860 census, there are 63 enslaved people working there. So this was a fairly big operation. And after the owner died in the early 1860s, that was Tillman, which the image you can see on screen now is an early map of the coast. And you can see there, that little circle, it's the word Tillman. That was the gentleman who owned it. And after he died, the estate was parceled off and given out to various descendants. And the main house was actually, they added a new wing onto it, and it became the Shady Side Inn, one of the first hotels on this part of the Grand Strand, that part of the coast. And a lot of what we know about the Ark Plantation comes from this gentleman, Mr. Sabe Rutledge. He was born at the Ark a few years before 1860, and then after the end of the Civil War, he continued to live in the area. In the 1930s, he was interviewed by Miss Chandler. She worked for the Federal Writers Project, so that was part of the New Deal effort under the Works Progress Administration, where writers were sent across the country. A lot of them wrote tourism guides, or they wrote like descriptions of different places for encyclopedias, and a few of them interviewed people who had been enslaved when they were young children. This was the first time that had been done on any scale, where people were talking to people who remembered being enslaved and said, what was life like for you and your family? And by this point, the people who remembered that they had been young children in the 1860s. So by the time you get to the 1930s, you're asking them, what do you remember about your childhood and about growing up? And they gave some very detailed accounts that have been an invaluable primary source for life in the 19th century. So by the time you get to the 1930s, say Rutledge is in his 50s, and he still lives in the area. He was actually a property owner by this point. He owned 25 acres near Sandy Ridge, and he talked about growing up on the plantation, about what he remembered eating, about doing, his mother, his grandmother, and a lot of the things that his family had done. And one of the things he said was that the old plantation cemetery, even though the plantation was long gone, was still there, and it was still being used by the community who lived around there. So he actually, when he passed in the 50s, in the 1950s, he was buried there, and that's where we kind of get to our next part. So the plantation cemetery, and this story really breaks my heart. So the reason you may be thinking, wait a minute, I've never heard of the Ark Plantation. I've heard of Drayton Hall and some of the big ones around Charleston, but I've never heard of the Ark Plantation. Well, after the plantation was parceled out, people stopped calling it that, and most of that community was bought and developed, and today we call it the town of Surfside Beach, which is one of only 8 incorporated communities in Horry County. And I found newspaper articles from the 1970s where the property was bought by a development company, and they start digging and they find bones. And they actually talk to some of the local residents who say, oh yeah, I remember when that was a cemetery. There were new people were being buried there into the 1950s and 1960s. And despite testimony that people remembered, oh yeah, there were burials and funerals out there, and despite them digging and finding the remains of coffins and bones, the cemetery was ruled to be abandoned because there weren't any headstones out there. And in 1980, the developers went to court, and the court ruled that the cemetery was abandoned, it was no longer in use, and they were free to develop it as they liked. So when you fast forward a few years, because on old maps, that area of Surfside Beach, it's a 2-block square that was marked as a cemetery, but evidently that wasn't sufficient evidence for them. But later definitive evidence is found that it was a cemetery, and that part of Surfside was not developed. Even today, there's a big clearing with some large oak trees, that historic marker, several historic signs that are illustrated with different pictures, and now we know for a fact it's a cemetery. That part of Surfside will likely never be developed, and that's one of our first sites. So it's a shame that more of that site couldn't have been saved, but it is, I think, a sign of progress that the development was halted and that site is going to be preserved, hopefully indefinitely. So to move a little further inland into Horry County, so our next site is the Free Woods community and Burgess. So to show you where that is on the map, that's a little further inland from Surfside. So today the community of Burgess is the area of Horry County in the very southern tip of the county between Highway 707 and the PD River. So it's kind of if you imagine Horry County as a diamond, then divide the bottom in half in 2 triangles. The left side is today the Burgess community. And a lot of this was at one point part of several plantations owned by a gentleman named Joshua Ward, who had more than 1,000 enslaved people across 6 plantations in the southern part of the county. And after the Civil War, a lot of these people continued to live in the area and actually managed to buy property and to form a handful of small communities. And we even have records of several of men from this community going off fighting in the First World War and then coming back and using their military pay and their army bonuses to buy more land and to develop fairly established communities. A lot of these communities were displaced by the construction of Highway 707, and some of these smaller communities, so these smaller communities kind of later fell under the umbrella of the Burgess community. So you had small towns like Freewoods, McDowell Shortcut, Holmestown. These were all under the umbrella of Burgess, which was the only community that had a federal post office. So this area today also has one of the two historic farms in Horry County. That would be the Freewoods Farms, which shows African American farmers and how kind of life changed and the important role they played in the county and in the community and in the field of agriculture from the 1860s into the early 20th century. And this area was also the site of the St. James Rosenwald School, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. So to go a little further north into Horry County, we get into the Bucksport community. So Bucksport is named for a gentleman named Henry Buck. And if any of you who have been to New England have seen Bucksport, Maine, he was a member of that same family. A few decades before the Civil War, he had a thought. It occurred to him, well, we're building a lot of so his family, they were shipbuilders. Bucksport, Maine was a large port and shipbuilding community. And he thought, we're building a lot of ships with southern timber, why not just build the ships down south? So there was an experiment to try to bring a shipbuilding industry down here. They built the wooden ship, the Henrietta, but they weren't able to sustain that because bringing dozens and dozens of trained shipbuilders from New England to South Carolina, feeding and housing them for several months ended up being a lot more expensive than they thought it would be. But Henry Buck realized, forget shipbuilding, the real money is in the timber. So he bought the Upper Mill Plantation and he built several large sawmills. So today the community of Bucksport, Bucksville, these were the communities that grew up around his sawmills, which continued even after the Civil War, and at their height were producing millions and millions of board feet of timber every year that were used in ships, in houses, in all kinds of structures across New England and across the South. So these communities today are just south of Horry County, just south of Conway, and the original plantation home, it's an event venue today that's privately owned, and these communities today are still primarily African American. So all of the people that lived in and around these, that worked in the sawmills, a lot of their descendants are still in the area today. And Bucksport has one of the branches of the Horry County Library. So that community is still kind of chugging along today. And to kind of go a little further up the coast, the next thing we're going to talk about is the town of Atlantic Beach. So when I talk about the incorporated communities in Horry County, to kind of explain why I keep saying that, Horry County is the biggest county in South Carolina. We're actually bigger by land area than the state of Rhode Island. And we have 8 incorporated communities. So there are towns that have tens of thousands of people and high schools and infrastructure, but aren't technically incorporated. So that's why I keep mentioning that. There's only a handful of towns that have incorporation in their own city governments and independent police forces and first responders and things like that. So one of the 8 incorporated towns is the city of Atlantic Beach. So this began as a project in the 1930s where an African American entrepreneur from North Carolina by the name of George Tyson, he came down from North Carolina and bought 47 acres on the Grand Strand. And this was during the Depression. This is when the Ocean Forest Hotel and the planned millionaires community of Arcadia were foundering and slowly tapering off. And at this point, the Grand Strand was still largely rural. You didn't see a lot of hotels. There weren't a lot of high rises. Most of the buildings on the coast were small restaurants, rental houses, mom and pop shops. It was still very underdeveloped. The idea that it would be this bustling, crowded city that we know today was not something that was even on the horizon yet. So George Tyson, though, he recognizes this is prime real estate. This is some really great ocean view that hasn't been developed. There's not a lot of people, and he saw an opportunity. So he buys 47 acres along the coast and begins to develop the community of Atlantic Beach. In the 40s, a group of black entrepreneurs, community leaders from North and South Carolina, they assumed ownership of that land because developing an entire community from the ground up is a lot for one person to do and a lot of financial risk for one person. So the Atlantic Beach Company then begins developing the town. They start dividing it up. They sell lots. Professionals from both Carolinas start building beach houses there. Some people begin to live there permanently. And during World War II, a lot of the black soldiers that were stationed in and around what was then the Myrtle Beach Army Air Force Base actually began to live in Atlantic Beach. And then after World War II, you have the tourist boom, you have the first interstates being built, and suddenly you have a lot of people that have automobiles, leisure times, and highways that will take them anywhere they want to go in the United States. And business in Atlantic Beach starts booming. because at this point in time, segregation is the law of the land. There are very few beach communities that have businesses and facilities that will serve black customers. And I've read accounts from the time period. Before Atlantic Beach was created, there were a handful of state parks where black families were allowed to go to the beach. And according to the accounts I've read, those places, most of them didn't have bathhouses, they didn't have electric, they had pavilions and picnic tables at the nicer ones. So when Atlantic Beach comes along, and they have, as you can see from this is a postcard that was based on an aerial photograph of the town. They have restaurants, hotels, motels, entertainment venues. So compared to what is essentially just a carved out space along the coast, this is a really amazing place where people can come and feel a sense of community and be among like-minded people and just enjoy the beautiful beaches that we have today. So for the next decade or so, business in Atlantic Beach is booming. They build several hotels like the Hotel Marshall. They have a very vibrant community, and the city of Atlantic Beach in the 1960s actually incorporates. And if you look at Atlantic Beach on a map, you'll see it's surrounded by the city of North Myrtle Beach. So once upon a time, there were 5 beaches north of Myrtle Beach, and over the course of the 1960s, they all incorporated. So at one point, you had, and I'm not going in any particular order, Crescent Beach, Ocean Drive Beach, Windy Hill Beach, Cherry Grove Beach, and Atlantic Beach. And in the late 60s, there was talk of, all right, instead of having 5 tiny towns right next to each other, we should just merge and have one big town. And Cherry Grove, Crescent, Ocean Drive, and Windy Hill, can you tell I spent a lot of time memorizing those? Yeah. They decided, we're going to merge, and the leaders of Atlantic Beach said, we would prefer to not join North Myrtle Beach. We want to retain our identity, retain our kind of local political system, which I understand. If Conway said, hey, we're going to join a much bigger city with a bunch of other connected towns, I would say, well, do we need to do that? So my point being, Atlantic Beach chose to remain independent, and the other 4 cities joined to form the new city of North Myrtle Beach. So there's a lot of efforts ongoing in the town now to preserve their unique history. There are several historical markers. They have their community center. And there is some talk between the city of Atlantic Beach, the county. There's been some talk of trying to open a museum or a gallery down there with some pictures and some exhibits to try to preserve that history and to make sure that the legacy of Atlantic Beach, which is even today, one of the few communities where almost all the businesses and the land are black owned, and for a long time, this was one of the only places where black vacationers could go to the beach and enjoy themselves and not feel like they were under the oppressive grip of Jim Crow. So there are efforts ongoing to try to preserve that valuable legacy and keep that history alive. So to move down the Grand Strand a little bit, one of the other major African American sites on the coast was a place called Charlie's Place. So a gentleman named Charlie Fitzgerald and his wife Sarah Fitzgerald, they opened a series of businesses that were right next to each other in the late 1930s. So the first place was a motel called the Fitzgerald's Motel. Next to it, there was a supper club, which some people also refer to as a nightclub. This was called the Whispering Pines Club. They also had a taxi business to take people all over the area. And because the motel and the Whispering Pines Club were right next to each other, instead of referring to the Whispering Pines Club and the Fitzgerald Motel, it was just kind of collectively known as Charlie's Place. So this motel not only served black people who were going on vacation, but also a lot of the African American entertainers who came to Myrtle Beach to perform, because of segregation, were not allowed to stay at the hotels they performed at, which just feels really, really spiteful and cruel, even for that time. But they could stay at the Fitzgerald Motel, at Charlie's Place. And there were reports that these entertainers would then do shows for the residents of Atlantic Beach, for residents who were coming from Myrtle Beach and from Atlantic Beach at the motel. And to tell you a little bit more about Charlie Fitzgerald, so he was a very interesting man. So one of the things that comes up in contemporary accounts of him was that he was well aware of segregation and Jim Crow laws, and he really didn't care. There were reports that he would go into the whites-only sections of restaurants and businesses, and people served him. They did business with him. He was well respected in the community and had enough standing that he would just openly defy Jim Crow, and people didn't really make a fuss about it, at least not many people. And to give you an idea of just how far this went, so let me show you this next picture. This is a picture taken in Charlie's Place. So this picture, we believe, is from the early 1950s, and you can see that's not segregation. There are white people and African American people at the same table talking, having a good time, because Charlie's Place, it was inviting, it was welcoming, had good food. Like I mentioned earlier, they would have performers coming in, and they didn't turn anybody away. So when some of the locals from Myrtle Beach and some of the other primarily white communities came in, they were welcome. The doors were open. And you have this kind of integration at Charlie's Place and in the Fitzgerald Motel decades before, and before most places would even have considered doing that. And, excuse me. So today, so the Whispering Pines Club, that was, I believe, torn down not long after. So Charlie passed in 1950. His widow passed a few decades later. That was torn down not long after she passed. And today, there are a few buildings left from the motel that are operated by the city of Myrtle Beach, and they're historic sites, and they're used as community centers and meeting places for local groups. So that's where the building is now. And to kind of go back to the story for just a moment. So, like I said, Charlie's Place, they had this kind of not quite integration, but the racial norms of the time were more or less checked at the door, because he believed that people should be able to be served and they should be able to work together and be entertained together without Jim Crow laws. And while a lot of people in and around Myrtle Beach didn't really have a problem with that, there were some people who very much did. So while this is going on, this is the early 1950s. So you have, in the late 1940s, you start to see the groups like the NAACP after World War II, start to say, okay, so we just fought World War II, and we fought that war for freedom, for liberty, so that people wouldn't be oppressed by tyrannical regimes. And when you do that and you come home to Jim Crow, it starts to feel, that's some real cognitive dissonance there. So you start to see, you see in 1948, actually a third-party attempt, the Dixiecrats, who were Southern Democrats that were so angry that their party would very tentatively and unenthusiastically embrace civil rights that they ran a third-party ticket. And in the early 1950s, as in the lead up to the Brown v. Board of Education decision that ruled that school segregation was unconstitutional, you see a marked rise in activity from the Ku Klux Klan. And in the Carolinas, the Klan started to have a massive spike in membership, and they did a series of marches through black communities throughout North and South Carolina. And one of these marches was through several African-American neighborhoods in Myrtle Beach. And Charlie Fitzgerald, who has been defying Jim Crow for decades and sees these laws with the contempt they deserve, he tells the sheriff, if those Klansmen come back, there's going to be trouble, there's going to be a problem. So when the Klansmen come back, Charlie Fitzgerald and several of his friends are waiting on their porches with shotguns, who are like letting them know, this is our community, you're not going to intimidate us. Unfortunately, the Klansmen see this, and they actually open fire into Charlie's Place. There's actually a brief gun battle in the streets of Myrtle Beach. Charlie Fitzgerald is abducted. He's taken away by the Klan. When the dust settles, only one person has been killed, a member of the Klan. It turned out to be a man from Conway. And Charlie Fitzgerald was beaten terribly, but he survived. And the sheriff actually went and arrested several members of the Klan. And unfortunately, they were never charged. The NAACP actually reached out to the federal government, to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and said, hey, he should testify, somebody should answer for this, and unfortunately that never happened. So the sheriff then, who had arrested several members of the Klan, those men were later released. The sheriff later lost his re-election campaign, but what you see is that, so Charlie Fitzgerald, even after this, he survived. He passed, like I said, he passed in 1955, and his legacy of standing up to Jim Crow and segregation, and even terrorist attempts to reinforce it, that has, at least some of it has been preserved in this historic site. And us at the Horry County Museum, we're working to preserve his legacy and his farsightedness and his vision. So we've kind of spent the last few minutes along the coast. I want to now kind of take a step back to something that some of us were talking about before the presentation, and something I mentioned during the slide about the Burgess community, which are the Rosenwald schools. So they're named after a gentleman named Julius Rosenwald. He was a clothing wholesaler who worked in Chicago for many years, and he was hired by Sears and Roebuck, and he was told, all right, so we have our catalogs, we're starting to get a lot of orders, and we really can't keep up with this anymore. We're getting overstretched. We like this whole system is kind of haphazard, and we can't afford to be haphazard anymore. So he was brought in. He brought in some new management techniques, some new organizing systems, ledgers, account books, that kind of thing, and he streamlined that process. And he took Sears and Roebuck, which had name recognition, and then he allowed them to grow into the behemoth that for a long time sent out catalogs every year. And if any one person could be said to have allowed them to grow into a household name, it was Julius Rosenwald. And doing that made him a fantastic amount of money. And one of the things he believed in was philanthropy. He didn't think that the wealthy should just sit on their wealth and move their money around and rest on their laurels. So he one day hears a speech from Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington was the president of Tuskegee Institute. This was one of the first and one of the most prominent historically black colleges and universities. It was in Alabama. And he heard a speech where Dr. Washington said that he thought it was important that the black children in the South, that they be educated, because at this point, most state governments, they didn't even really pretend to care that they had some obligation to do this. Black schools, if they existed at all, were generally, they weren't even standalone school buildings. Most black children were educated in churches or in old hunting cabins or in old preachers' houses next to churches. There was very little infrastructure in place. And Booker T. Washington gave a speech decrying this, saying that it was a travesty, and this really resonated with Julius Rosenwald. So he goes to Booker T. Washington and says, I want to help you with your cause, and Booker T. Washington gets to work. He goes back to the Tuskegee Institute and has several members of the faculty draw up plans for schoolhouses. They have big windows to incorporate a lot of natural light. They have several large rooms. The idea is to make schoolhouses where a lot of children can be educated, because most of these rural areas didn't have electricity yet, is to build schoolhouses that can be built in the community to serve as schools for the children and to be able to educate as many people as are needed. And over the course of the next decade, there were thousands of Rosenwald schools built all over the South. South Carolina got 5,000 of them. I believe only 2 states received more Rosenwald schools than did South Carolina. So our state benefited greatly from this program. And to give you a list, just kind of give you an idea, these are all the Rosenwald schools that at one point existed in Horry County. So there were quite a few of them built over the course of the 20s and the 30s. And to give you an idea of how much of an impact this had, not just in Horry County, but all over the country, there were some estimates done that there was a window of time in the late 1920s into the mid-1930s where, by some estimates, a third of the black students in the South went to school in a Rosenwald school. So these schools were really, they helped educate a lot of people who would have otherwise either not had a school or had a school that was small and cramped, that was an abandoned building that was finding a second life later. So this is one of those plans, and you can see they have several rooms. You can see the markings where they had their large windows, and they made a lot of use of the space they had, and a lot of these buildings followed this plan. There were a couple of variations. There were some that were designed to be a little bigger, some that were designed to be smaller. So here are several from Horry County. So there was one in Loris that was one of the most expensive ones built, and that one is noted because funds were raised by the black community and by the white community. So the reason I mention that, one of the kind of cornerstones of the Rosenwald schools and of this program was that the Rosenwald Foundation, they thought, all right, if we just cut a check and build a school, then that could be interpreted as, we don't think that the locals in these counties can do it themselves, so we think we have to step in and do it. And they thought that was a bit paternalistic and condescending. So their approach was that they would go to counties, go to communities, and they would say, we will put up some of the money, and then that needs to be matched by the school district or the local community or both. And the idea was that the local community would then be shareholders in these buildings, and they would feel like this is something that they had done instead of just something that some rich person from up north had come down and done without really asking for their opinions. So we have several of these. There were several in Loris, around Conway. They were all over Horry County. So we have a few more here. These were, and for the most part, these schools were what we would call today K through 9 or K through 8 schools. So these were primary schools. And these were all over the county. We have records that, let's see, these are just some more of them. There are also schools we found where they follow these floor plans, they look like Rosenwald schools, which, as I said, they have this very distinct look to them. But historians have looked through the archives of the Rosenwald Foundation, which are, I believe, at Vanderbilt University today, and they're not in there. So what we believe this means is that some of these communities, they went and found the plans for the Rosenwald schools, which were published and publicly available. Booker T. Washington made sure that it wasn't something that was hard to find. He wanted it to be accessible. And without going to the Rosenwald school, they rallied together and built the schools themselves without any without any funding from this outside group. So when we talk about Rosenwald schools, several of them were not built with any Rosenwald money. They were built by the communities themselves. Luckily, they raised their own money and probably built the buildings themselves just with members of the community. So there were several in and around the coast. One of them, in fact, the school on y'all's right, in the top right corner, that was on the title slide, that's the Myrtle Beach Colored School. That's one of these buildings where there's no record of it in the Rosenwald Foundation records. This was built by members of the community. And this was one of the first schools in the Myrtle Beach area built to educate African American students. And it was used until 1954 when a new school, the Carver Training School, was built a few blocks away. And today, the Myrtle Beach School, it was for several decades, it remained there, but the building deteriorated, and later, when they were expanding one of the highways, the highway expanded right through where the school was. So some alumni of the school worked with the city of Myrtle Beach, and they built a replica of it using the original plans a few blocks away that is today open as the Myrtle Beach Colored School and Education Center. It's used as a community space by the city of Myrtle Beach. They have a museum there about the school and the alumni and all the contributions it made to the community. So today you can go and see the Myrtle Beach Colored School Museum, and it's a replica that was built exactly to look like the original school. So here's one of the plans in a little more depth. This is one of the bigger ones. You can see they had 4 classrooms, one of which could be subdivided into an auditorium. You can see at the top, those would have been outhouses that were built because, again, a lot of these rural communities didn't have sewers, plumbing, electricity. So they designed these schools with that in mind, so that even children who didn't live in a community with electrification could still go to a school with a lot of natural light and get an education and learn and better their lives. So I said a lot of these were K-8 schools. A handful of them had high schools, but for many years, most black students in Horry County, when they went to high school, went to the Whittemore School in Conway. So the Whittemore School was named after a gentleman named Benjamin Whittemore. He was a Methodist minister from Massachusetts who joined the United States Army during the Civil War. He served as a chaplain for 2 different Massachusetts regiments. After the war ended and his units were demobilized, he remained in South Carolina and worked with the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, which is shortened to the Freedmen's Bureau, which was essentially the federal bureau in charge of working with recently freed enslaved people to try to make sure that their rights, that their new rights, now that slavery had been ended, weren't just being trampled on by the former Confederates. So he worked with the Whittemore School as one of their supervisors. He helped found several churches and schools. So when the Whittemore School was founded, it was named after him. And this is, I believe, the second of 3 buildings. It relocated twice. One of the schools burned down in what was believed to have been an electrical fire. So the Whittemore School went through a few different iterations, and it wasn't just one building. It had several outbuildings in and around the campus. And by the time you get to the 1960s, it has science labs, typing classes, and it's seen as this institution in Horry County. In fact, Conway's current mayor, Barbara Blaine Bellamy, who was recently reelected, she was a member of the final graduating class of Whittemore High School, which finished in 1970. And when the 1970-1971 school year started, Whittemore High School became Conway Junior High School. And it continued as that for about a decade until the high school was divided, and then it continued serving as West Conway Junior High School until it was renamed Whittemore Park School in the 1990s. So unfortunately, most of the original buildings aren't like they were because at one point there were buildings on campus in the 70s and 80s that had been built in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. A lot of these buildings were torn down and replaced over time. The main building of Whittemore School was, they moved out of it in the late 1980s and built the current Whittemore Park School, which is actually about to be replaced itself. There's a new Whittemore Park Junior High School being built not far from the Walmart in Conway. So that name has been on, I think, five or six different schools now, and the new Whittemore Park School, it looks sturdy. I suspect it's going to be used for several decades to come. So I have mentioned Whittemore High School, I mentioned the Carver Training School earlier. These were all part of kind of the same broader effort, and that was the equalization schools. So I mentioned earlier that after World War II, you see civil rights groups starting to bring court cases forward, starting to lobby to dismantle this whole regime of racist laws, and by the time you get to the mid-1950s, they're making pretty good progress. Like the Supreme Court has ruled that the all-white primary election is unconstitutional. They're starting to, graduate programs in Texas and Oklahoma have been ordered to integrate. You even start to see federal court rulings that segregation among certain facilities for interstate travel are, they're ordered to integrate. A lot of them don't, but they are ordered to. And it's becoming pretty clear to those who are paying attention that the days of the federal government just kind of turning a blind eye to the open legal segregation, that those days are pretty rapidly coming to an end. So in 1950, a group of parents from Clarendon County, South Carolina, they go to the school board and say, we have a school for our children, but some children are walking 5 and 6, 7 miles to and from school every day. Can we have a school bus? The school board says, no, you may not. So they say, okay. Then they go out and buy an old school bus, fix it up, repair it. So several of the parents get together, they work on it, they get it working. They say, all right, you don't want to give us a school bus? Fine, we built our own. Can we just have some gasoline to run the school bus? That's all we want. And the school board says, no, you don't pay enough in taxes, we're not helping you. So several of these families take this school board to court in a case called Briggs v. Elliott. Briggs was one of the families, one of the students. Elliott was the school superintendent of Clarendon County at the time. And this is one of several cases that are making their way up the Supreme Court where the question is school segregation constitutional? Is that something that can be allowed to continue? So several of these cases are all consolidated under one case under the name Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. That decision was made because in Topeka, Kansas, the high school was integrated, but the elementary schools and junior high schools were not. And Topeka, Kansas was one of the only places in the United States where the schools for white students and the schools for African American students were actually close to being equal. They received equal funding, the schools were well maintained, and the reason the case was known as Brown v. Board was that was a choice made by some of the attorneys because they wanted to make a statement that school segregation was not just a problem in the southern United States. So that's how Briggs v. Elliott, a case from South Carolina, kind of comes under the broader moniker of a case that originates in Kansas. So when this case makes its way to the Supreme Court, suddenly a lot of the leaders in the southern states getting nervous because they've seen this trend of the government beginning to recognize and enforce civil rights legislation. So their solution is to get out in front of it. They think that if they can build new schools, that if they can say, sorry, separate but equal, those schools have been neglected for decades, that they think if they can build schools that are actually equal, then maybe they will be allowed to keep Jim Crow, to maintain segregation. So there is a flurry of building across the South. Whittemore High School actually gets a new building in 1954. Myrtle Beach gets the Carver Training School in 1953. And these schools, which you can see here, they're one story, they're kind of long, wide buildings. The idea is that they can be expanded upon as necessary. And these are just the ones in Horry County. So a lot of counties all over the South got schools like this. And these schools were built in the 50s. And the idea was that if there were all these new schools and if they were equal, then the hope was that they could skirt around integration. Well, that plan didn't work because the court ruled in Brown v. Board that what they said was it doesn't matter what the schools look like, having separate schools is inherently unequal. By separating people out and saying you cannot go to a school because of the color of your skin, that inherently means that there are people who are deemed inferior by the state, and that was ruled as a violation of the 14th, words, there are too many consonants in that sentence, that was ruled to be a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. So you may be thinking, well, hold on, schools didn't integrate in 1954. What happened? So the next year, when this ruling comes down, the response from a lot of authorities in the South is, well, we have a dual school system. What do you actually want us to do? You know, we have this system that's been in place for decades. How do we actually get rid of this? And the court said, well, so what you need to do, you need to have schools where the student body is integrated, the faculty is integrated, and you need to totally integrate your schools. And the court said, we recognize this isn't something you can do overnight, so you need to proceed with all deliberate speed, was the phrase the Supreme Court used. And that was taken to mean, just get around to it in your own sweet time, when you can take care of it. Don't rush, there's no timetable here. They didn't want to put a date on the calendar, so that was then taken as license to just not integrate for the better part of a decade. But then as the 60s go on, as the modern civil rights movement starts to pick up steam, you start to see integration. The first school system in South Carolina to integrate was Charleston County. They began integrating in 1963. Horry County, the first integration here, in Horry County, happens in 1965 when a handful of students began integrating Myrtle Beach High School. And then you have another Supreme Court ruling in 1968. And when the 1970-1971 school year starts, that is the first fully integrated school year in Horry County. And like I said, that's when Whittemore School becomes Conway Junior High School, and then Conway High School and the junior high schools are then integrated. So that's a very long way of saying that in the 50s, we have a wave of school buildings that were built to try to get around Brown v. Board. And when integration happened, there were, and I've seen newspaper articles, there were members of the black community in Horry County who said, we have these schools and a lot of these institutions, even if the buildings are new, these schools have been in place for decades, we would like to continue using them, for them to be, for them to continue being part of the school system. And unfortunately, almost all of them weren't. A handful of integration schools were used. North Myrtle Beach High School was one of these equalization schools that was still used. A handful of them were used as office space or overflow for the school district, but most of them were they closed the doors, boarded up the windows, and walked away. So that's what happened to the original Whittemore School, was that it was just closed. It was for a little while, it was used as offices by the county, and eventually they just said, this building, we can't repair it, we don't want to repair it, we have other things to spend our money on. So places like Whittemore School, like the school in Bucksport, like the school in Sweet Home, and then Levister Elementary, which was north of Loris. These buildings were just closed and left, and they're falling apart today. So these buildings, a lot of them, so some of them have been partially torn down, but most of them they're just open to the elements and they're just falling down. And the original Whittemore School, there was a fire believed to have been the result of vandalism from someone sleeping in the building, but most of that actually burned in 2023. So hopefully in the future, there will be efforts. There's a group in Conway called the Whittemore Race Path Historical Society that is working to try to preserve some of these structures and to preserve this African American history. But for now, we may not be able to save the buildings, but we can definitely save their memory. And it's important that this history of Horry County and of other places across the South, that some of it's really hard to hear about. It's hard to hear of just this state-sanctioned cruelty and indifference, but it's important that we remember this, and it's important that we decide that going forward, things are going to be different, and that instead of history being just left here to disintegrate, that it's maintained and it's repaired so that we can all learn from it in the future. So here are some more resources. There's a book called The Green Book of South Carolina, which was a compilation of several issues of the Green Book, which was a guidebook for African American travelers. It was divided by state, and it showed by county, businesses that would cater to African American travelers. So hotels, restaurants, even car repair shops, beauty salons, and places like Charlie's Place in Myrtle Beach, and like the Hotel Marshall. These were prominent entries in there for several years. And like I said, several of these historic sites in Myrtle Beach have been preserved. They're operated by the city, and the Surfside Beach Historical Society has also been a very useful resource learning about the Ark Plantation and about communities on the coast. So thank you all very much for coming. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you to those of you who are watching with us online. Hope you have a great rest of your day. I just threw a lot of information at y'all very quickly, so that's about all I have. If any of you have any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer them. And thank you all again very much for your time, and thank you for the Georgetown Library for having me.
Tom, you want to go through what you have there for?
Yes. So the Green Book of South Carolina, like I said, that's an online compendium of several online issues of the Green Book. It was published every year beginning in the early 1930s, and the last issue was published in 1967. They stopped production after that, after integration really took root. And then Freewood's Farms is a historic site. It's privately owned, so the L.W. Paul Living History Farm outside of Conway is part of the Horry County government. Freewood Farms is operated by a private group, and my director and several of my supervisors have worked with them. They do very interesting interpretation. They're doing good work out there. So they're in the southern part of Horry County if you want to go see them. Charlie's Place is, like I said, maintained by the city of Myrtle Beach. That's a museum and community space. They have pretty regular activities there. I believe there's a calendar on a web page maintained by the city of Myrtle Beach that shows what programming they have there. Sabe Rutledge's interview, you can find that there through. It has been published by the Independent Republic Quarterly. That's the old historical journal of Horry County. You can also find that through the Library of Congress. So Sabe Rutledge's interview, I only kind of gave you a kind of a cross section of what it has, but it has his recollections of his life and of growing up in the 1860s and life in the 19th century. It's a fascinating fascinating resource, and there are others that are again available through the Library of Congress. And then finally, and if you are interested in doing research, like I said, the Horry County Historical Society has pages and pages of journals and historical articles and interesting primary sources. You don't need to log in, you don't need to pay for that, that's all free. And then finally, we have the website for the Surfside Beach Historical Society, and members of that were working with descendants of the community in Surfside Beach to preserve the Ark Cemetery, so they're active down there working to preserve that history. And if you'd like to come see us at the Horry County Museum, we have some exhibits about African American history in Horry County. We are working to preserve that history. And so yeah, those are the resources that we have. Thank you for that. Anybody else have any questions? Like I said, yes, ma'am.
I just want to let you know you had an excellent presentation.
Thank you.
I just want to tap to the Green Book. That,
Oh, yes.
the Green Book is actually a person's name. It's a postman's name, a black postman's name.
Sorry?
The Green Book. Green is the postman's
Right.
name.
Yes,
I think a lot of the declining is after he died, including immigration. He dies about the same time that immigration is picking up. And I think last but not least, everybody thinks that the Green Book was all about the South. It really wasn't about all of the country. And I think the most distinctive path that he took here was Route 66, going from the east to the west, literally in the middle of the country. So the Green Book is just not a southern locality. It's about United States locality.
yes, ma'am. That's a very good point. So for those of you online or who may not have heard that, so what was your name again, ma'am? So Ms. Vinnie was explaining to us that the Green Book, it doesn't just cover the southern United States, it covers the whole country. When I worked at Historic Columbia, they had a reprinting of one of the editions from the late 50s, I believe, and it had 48 states in there. When I say it, I don't mean it didn't have Alaska and Hawaii. It had those. It didn't have Nevada and Vermont, or maybe New Hampshire. I don't know what was going on in those two states, but for whatever reason, they didn't submit anything to the Green Book. And that name, the book had a green cover, but that was the last name of a businessman who worked as a postman at one point in life, who published this guide for African Americans traveling throughout the United States. So that's a very good point. Thank you, ma'am. Yeah, so all right, so appreciate that contribution. That's very kind of helpful for helping us better understand. Anybody else have any questions? Any burning questions?
Well, Tom, thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Thank you all very much.
Great presentation and very helpful. And to be able to put some of these sites on your travels and visits, to be able to see some of them. Carol and I saw an article on Atlantic Beach about a year or so ago and thought we need to go visit there. And it's just very interesting to be able to visit, and sad as far as some of its history, but also to recognize an incredible group of people who were a part of that community and are a part of that community even today. We gave out, as you came in today, some of our announcements and activities that are coming up between now and May, and we want to encourage you to participate. And if you're feeling in a gardening mood, unfortunately 36-degree temperatures in the morning don't put you in a gardening mood, but right now, actually, these 3 days, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, we're in the process of one of our major projects for the Friends of the Library, with our new library coming along, of doing some landscaping around there. Dwight McInvale, the director of the library, as most of you know this, asked if we, as the Friends, would help underwrite costs and also volunteer our very sore muscles right now to be able to participate in that landscaping. And if you are free this afternoon from 1 to 4, or tomorrow from 9 to noon and 1 to 4 in the afternoon, we're finishing up that landscaping. Drive past, and it looks really beautiful already, if I may brag. We've been planting a lot yesterday, got a lot of work done, and the section along Church Street, Route 17, has been landscaped already, and some more of it's taking place with around the building, the new auditorium, as well as a lot of mulch being placed tomorrow. So if you just have this, really want to do early gardening and would like to join with us, some of you are already signed up, but we could use some more tomorrow, this afternoon, and tomorrow as well. That's on the list there. 1 week from today in the afternoon, 4:30 to 6 o'clock, is our annual meeting of the Friends. And we have some business to take care of, election of officers and accountability, how our finances are looking and some of the projects we're participating in. That's going to be next Tuesday, a week from today, at the Howard Center. We have some snacks when we get together. We have the business meeting. And as we always say, what's going to draw people in is we've asked Steve Williams to come and share with us concerning his recently published book on the relationship of Harriet Tubman and James Bowley. And this will be an excellent presentation. Steve's always the case. But I hope you'll join us for that business meeting, annual meeting, 4:30 to 6 o'clock next Tuesday at the Howard Center. Our community yard sale, our fall community yard sale is coming up. Already we're up to about a dozen people who have signed up, and it's still well in advance. That's going to be in the parking lot at the new courthouse behind the library, and a lot of people are interested in that. Come to buy, and if you're interested to come to sell, very inexpensive, $15 for a parking spot, $20 for two, and a good way to be able to get rid of that stuff in your house that you've been wanting to get rid of. And what? Oh, that's going to be on March 16th. Thank you for my corrector and improver. On March 16th, and if it rains perchance, and we've had 2 in a row already that got rained out, it'll be on the 23rd, the following Saturday. Our next Tuesdays with, and I want to get the visuals here, I brought them along. We've had a tradition this month, obviously in February, historic Black events and activities to be able to familiarize and broaden our perspectives on things. But in March, our theme has been poetry. And we've had we had wonderful presentations. And for the next month, which is going to be on March 19th, we're going to have Eunice Brown join with us. Eunice is a poet, a local poet here in Georgetown, retired educator, and an active member at Bethel AME Church. Our connection happened last year. You may recall we were celebrating in one of our presentations the 160th anniversary of Bethel AME Church, and she did a poem for that occasion. It was absolutely wonderful and beautiful, and so we've asked Eunice to come, and a couple of her books I have here, Harvesting Blessing, Poems for All Occasions, and the one that's going to be focus of our presentation next month is Melodies of the Heart. And I know you'll be really blessed with her poetry and her talk on how she writes and what brings these ideas to her mind. It'll just be a wonderful presentation next month on March 19th. Or right here, once again in the Wynyard Auditorium. Oh, one other thing, and that's Harriet behind me. We put together a banner of our ongoing project beside the landscaping project for the children's reading section. Most of you are aware of this, the children's reading section of our renovated library. We're going to be contributing, again, as friends and community, putting all this together, a statue that will be very special for our children, that we just think is a wonderful and ideal way to be able to commemorate our community, our children, our library. And that is, again, celebrating the relationship between Harriet Tubman and her grandnephew, James Boley, who lived here in Georgetown and was with that first group of people that she rescued through the Underground Railroad. And so what we are going to be doing is a statue done by Wesley Wofford, who is the same artist who did the Harriet Tubman statue that was there in Rainey Park last fall. And we have this banner, which is a way to sort of remind it, and I particularly like this because we've talked about the size of the statue is going to be, we're not doing a Harriet Tubman like it's in Rainey Park, but we're doing a statue about this size, and this will be also about the height, and the intent is for children to be able to reach it and touch it. It's a please touch statue. But one also to really bring to their mind this wonderful story of Harriet Tubman and her sacrifice to be able to support her grandnephew, to be able to go through school, and then come here to Georgetown, serve as superintendent of schools, to be on the board of the University of South Carolina, and serve in many other capacities in a public way to really significantly impact our history in the Reconstruction era, however short it was, but nevertheless very important. If you'd like to contribute to that, we'd love your donations. It's going to be our community together raising about $40,000 to be able to fund that statue and to be able to place it in our new library. And if you're interested, information there and also online. That's a lot of announcements, and I don't usually do that many, but just want to get them all to my friends here and a reminder. Tom, thanks for a wonderful presentation, and I encourage you, if you've not been to the Horry County Museum, to pay a visit and then ask him any more questions and put him on the spot. Anyway, Tom, thank you. And I thank all of you. Thanks for being here today.